Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 11. Nightgown. We had been lying in bed, chatting and dozing off here and there. Queequeg would sometimes affectionately drape his tattooed legs over mine and then pull them back. We were so comfortable and relaxed with each other that eventually, after all our conversations, neither of us felt sleepy anymore. Even though it was still quite a while until dawn, we were wide awake and ready to get up. We grew so restless that lying down became uncomfortable. Bit by bit, we sat up, keeping the blankets tucked around us for warmth. We leaned against the headboard, knees drawn up close, with our noses practically touching them, as if our knees were warming pans. It felt cozy, especially because it was cold outside, and even a bit chilly out from under the covers since there was no fire in the room. Actually, a little cold made the warmth even better. After all, nothing feels good unless it's compared to something else. If you think you're perfectly comfortable for too long, you stop noticing it. But if part of you, like your nose or the top of your head, is slightly cold, the rest of your body feels wonderfully warm by comparison. That's why I believe bedrooms shouldn't have fires. They're an unnecessary luxury. The true pleasure comes from being snug under a blanket with the cold air all around you. In that moment, you feel like the single warm spark in the middle of a freezing Arctic world. We had been sitting like this for a while when I decided to open my eyes. I have this habit of keeping my eyes closed when I'm between the sheets, whether I'm awake or asleep, because it helps me focus on the coziness of being in bed. I believe that a person can only truly feel their own sense of self with their eyes closed, as if darkness is more natural for our inner selves, while light is better suited for our physical bodies. So, when I opened my eyes, leaving my own peaceful darkness for the gloom of midnight, I felt an unpleasant jolt. Queequeg suggested we light a lamp since we were wide awake, and he wanted to enjoy a few quiet puffs from his tomahawk pipe. Although I had been against him smoking in bed the night before, it's funny how our rigid opinions soften when friendship comes into play. Now, I actually liked it when Queequeg smoked beside me, even in bed, because it brought a peaceful, homey vibe to the room. I wasn't worried about the landlord's insurance policy anymore. I was simply enjoying the comfortable intimacy of sharing a pipe and a blanket with a true friend. Wrapped in our jackets, we passed the tomahawk pipe back and forth until a blue cloud of smoke hung over us, softly lit by the newly lit lamp. Whether the smoke made Queequeg think of far-off places, I can't say, but he started talking about his home island. Eager to hear his story, I asked him to continue, and he gladly did. Although I didn't fully understand everything he said at the time, as I later grew more accustomed to his way of speaking, I eventually grasped the whole story. Now, I can retell it as best I can, though it will only be a brief outline. Chapter 12. Biographical. Queequeg was from Rokovoko, an island far off to the west and south. It's not on any map. Real places never are. As a young boy running wild in his homeland, wearing only a grass skirt and followed by goats, Queequeg already had a deep desire to see more of the civilized world than the few whaling ships that occasionally visited. His father was a king, his uncle a high priest, and his mother's family included fierce warriors. He had royal blood, though it had been somewhat tainted by his youthful cannibalistic tendencies. One day, a ship from Sag Harbor visited his father's island, and Queequeg tried to board it to travel to Christian lands. However, the ship was full, and even his father's royal influence couldn't secure him a spot. But Queequeg was determined. He took his canoe out to a narrow strait he knew the ship would pass through as it left the island. Hiding his canoe among the mangroves, he waited. As the ship passed, he paddled out swiftly, reached the side of the ship, and in a single motion, sank his canoe, climbed up the ship's chains, and threw himself onto the deck. He grabbed a ring on the deck and swore he wouldn't let go, even if they cut him to pieces. The captain threatened to throw him overboard and even raised a sword to his wrists, but Queequeg, being the son of a king, didn't budge. Impressed by his courage and determination, the captain finally gave in and let him stay on board. However, instead of treating him like royalty, they put him with the sailors and trained him to be a whaleman. But Queequeg, like the Russian Tsar who once worked in foreign shipyards, didn't care about the hardship. He was driven by a deep desire to learn from the Christians so he could bring new knowledge back to his people and improve their lives. Sadly, he soon realized that even Christians could be miserable and wicked, more so than his own people. When he arrived in Sag Harbor and later Nantucket and saw how sailors wasted their money and lived recklessly, he gave up on the idea of becoming Christian. He thought, "It's a wicked world everywhere. I'll die a pagan." Even though he remained a pagan at heart, Queequeg lived among Christians, wore their clothes, and tried to speak their language. That's why he had such strange habits, even after being away from home for so long. I hinted to him about whether he planned to go back and take over his father's throne, since his father was likely dead by now. Queequeg said no, not yet. He was afraid that being around Christians had changed him too much to rule over his pure pagan people. But someday, he said, he would return, once he felt baptized back into his old ways. For now, he wanted to travel the world and live freely. He had become a harpooner, and his harpoon was now his royal scepter. When I asked him what he planned to do next, he said he wanted to go back to sea in his old job. I told him I was planning to go whaling out of Nantucket, the best port for an aspiring whaleman. He immediately decided to come with me, join the same ship, be in the same crew, and share every experience with me. I happily agreed, since not only had I grown fond of Queequeg, but his skills as a harpooner would be invaluable to someone like me, who was new to whaling but familiar with the sea. After finishing his story and taking his last puff from his pipe, Queequeg hugged me, pressed his forehead against mine, and blew out the light. We then drifted off to sleep. Chapter 13. Wheelbarrow. The next morning, Monday, after selling the embalmed head to a barber for use as a wig stand, I settled our bill, using Queequeg's money, of course. The landlord and the other boarders found it hilarious how quick Queequeg and I had become friends, especially since Peter Coffin's wild stories about him had terrified me just a short time ago. We borrowed a wheelbarrow, packed up our belongings, my small carpet bag and Queequeg's canvas sack and hammock, and made our way down to the schooner, the Moss, which was docked at the wharf. As we went along, people stared. They weren't shocked by Queequeg. Seeing cannibals in the streets wasn't unusual for them, but by how friendly we were. We didn't pay them any attention, taking turns pushing the wheelbarrow. Occasionally, Queequeg stopped to adjust the sheath on his harpoon. I asked him why he bothered bringing it ashore when all whaling ships provided their own. He explained that while that was true, he had a special connection to his harpoon, which had served him well in many battles with whales. It was like how some farmers bring their own tools, even when they aren't required to. As he took over the wheelbarrow from me, Queequeg told a funny story about the first time he saw a wheelbarrow in Sag Harbor. The owners of his ship had lent him one to carry his heavy chest to his boarding house. Not wanting to seem ignorant about how to use it, though he had no idea, he put the chest on the barrow, tied it down, then lifted the entire thing onto his shoulders and carried it down the wharf. I laughed and said, "Queequeg, you should have known better. Didn't people laugh at you?" In response, he told me another story. At wedding feasts on his island, Rokovoko, they squeeze the juice of young coconuts into a large, decorated bowl, which serves as the centerpiece of the feast. One time, a grand merchant ship arrived at Rokovoko, and the captain, a very proper man for a seafarer, was invited to Queequeg's sister's wedding feast. She was a princess, just 10 years old. When the captain arrived at the bride's bamboo cottage, he was seated in the place of honor, next to Queequeg's father, the king, and the high priest. Once grace was said, Queequeg noted that, unlike us, they look upward while giving thanks, mimicking ducks. The high priest began the traditional ceremony by dipping his fingers into the bowl. Thinking the punch bowl was a large finger bowl, and believing he outranked the island king as a ship's captain, the captain proceeded to wash his hands in it. "What do you think happened next?" Queequeg asked. "Didn't our people laugh?" Finally, with our passage paid and luggage secured, we boarded the schooner. As the sail was hoisted, the ship began gliding down the Acushnet River. On one side, New Bedford rose in layers of streets, the ice-covered trees glittering in the cold, clear air. Huge stacks of barrels lined the wharves, and whale ships from around the world lay silent and safely docked. From some ships came the sounds of carpenters and coopers, with fires burning to melt pitch, all signaling that new voyages were about to begin. One long, dangerous journey had ended, only for another to start, and so on forever. Such is the endless cycle of all earthly work. As we reached the open sea, the wind grew stronger, and the little ship Moss tossed foam from its bow like a young colt snorting. I breathed in that invigorating sea air, feeling liberated from the beaten paths of land where people's footsteps marked the ground. I turned to admire the endless ocean, which leaves no trace or record of those who cross it. Queequeg seemed to share my excitement, his nostrils flaring as he grinned, showing his sharp, filed teeth. We sped forward, and once we were out to sea, the Moss bent to the wind, dipping its bow like a servant bowing to a king. The ship leaned to the side, moving quickly, its ropes humming like tight wires, and the tall masts bent like reeds in a storm. We were so caught up in the wild scene at the bow that we didn't notice the mocking glances of the passengers for a while. These landlubbers, clearly out of their element, seemed puzzled by our friendship, as if a white man couldn't be on equal terms with someone like Queequeg. A few of them, clearly clueless country folk, watched us with wide-eyed innocence. One particularly foolish young man started mimicking Queequeg behind his back. I thought the guy was done for. Queequeg, dropping his harpoon, grabbed the bumpkin and with incredible skill and strength tossed him into the air. He gave him a light tap mid-flip, causing him to land on his feet, gasping for breath. Without a word, Queequeg lit his tomahawk pipe and passed it to me. "Captain! Captain!" the terrified bumpkin yelled, running to the officer in charge. "Captain, the devil's on board!" "What's going on here?" demanded the captain, a tall, gaunt man as he approached Queequeg. "You could have killed him, you know that?" "What did he say?" Queequeg asked me calmly. "He says you nearly killed that man," I replied, pointing to the still shaking greenhorn. "Killed him?" Queequeg scoffed, twisting his tattooed face in disdain. "He's a tiny fish. Queequeg doesn't kill small fish. Queequeg kills big whales." "Listen," the captain growled, "I'll kill you if you pull another stunt like that on my ship. So watch yourself." But at that moment, the captain had bigger problems. The pressure on the mainsail had snapped the rope, and the massive boom was swinging wildly across the deck, knocking people overboard. Panic spread, and trying to stop the boom seemed suicidal. It swung back and forth like the jaw of a raging whale. No one knew what to do, and everyone rushed to the front of the ship, watching the boom in terror. In the midst of the chaos, Queequeg calmly dropped to his knees, crawled under the boom's path, grabbed a rope, and secured one end to the side of the ship. He then lassoed the boom as it passed over his head, and with the next swing, the boom was caught and the danger was over. The crew turned the schooner into the wind, preparing the lifeboat. Meanwhile, Queequeg, now stripped to the waist, leaped overboard with a graceful dive. For several minutes, we watched him swim through the freezing water, his powerful arms cutting through the foam. I admired his strength, but saw no one to rescue. The greenhorn had gone under. Suddenly, Queequeg shot up from the water, looked around, then dived back down. A few moments later, he resurfaced, one arm swimming while the other held the lifeless body of the bumpkin. The crew quickly pulled them into the boat, and after some effort, the young man was revived. The entire crew hailed Queequeg as a hero, and even the captain apologized to him. From that moment on, I stuck to Queequeg like a barnacle until the day he took his final dive. Yet, Queequeg seemed completely unaware of his heroism. He didn't expect any reward or recognition. All he asked for was fresh water to wash off the salt. After cleaning up, he put on dry clothes, lit his pipe, and leaned against the railing, quietly observing the people around him. It was as if he was thinking, "This world is a shared venture. We cannibals need to help these Christians." Chapter 14. Nantucket. Nothing else of note happened on our journey, so after a smooth and fast trip, we safely arrived at Nantucket. Nantucket. Pull out your map and take a look at where it's located. It sits off the coast, so far out it feels lonelier than a lighthouse in the middle of the sea. Just look at it. A little mound of sand, a spit of beach with no land behind it. There's more sand there than you could ever use in 20 years, even if you replaced all your blotting paper with it. Some people joke that they have to plant weeds because nothing grows naturally there. They say they have to import thistles from Canada and even order special wood from overseas to plug oil cask leaks. They joke that wood is so rare in Nantucket that pieces of it are carried around like holy relics, and people plant toadstools by their doors for shade in the summer. A single blade of grass is an oasis, and finding 3 blades in one day feels like stumbling onto a prairie. People are said to wear special shoes for walking on the quicksand, similar to snowshoes worn by Laplanders. They're so isolated, surrounded entirely by the ocean, that clams are even found sticking to the furniture, like they would to the shells of sea turtles. But these are just exaggerations, meant to highlight how different Nantucket is from somewhere like Illinois. Now, consider the fascinating story of how the island was first discovered by Native Americans. According to legend, a long time ago, an eagle swooped down along the New England coast and snatched a baby from an Indian family. The parents, heartbroken, watched as their child was carried away over the ocean. Determined to find their lost baby, they set out in their canoes. After a dangerous journey, they found an island, and there, lying on the sand, they found a small ivory chest, the skeleton of their child. Is it any surprise, then, that the people of Nantucket, born on a beach, would turn to the sea to make a living? At first, they started by catching crabs and clams in the sand. As they grew braver, they ventured out with nets to catch mackerel. Gaining more experience, they launched boats and began catching cod. Eventually, they built large ships and set sail to explore the vast oceans, circling the globe over and over, passing through places like the Bering Strait. In every season, in every ocean, they waged an endless war against the largest, most powerful creature to survive since the Great Flood, the whale. These giant creatures, as massive as mountains, possess an unconscious strength so immense that their panicked thrashing is more dangerous than their most aggressive attacks. And so, these simple Nantucketers, these hermits of the sea, set out from their tiny island and took control of the oceans, much like Alexander the Great conquered the land. They divided the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans among themselves, like pirates carving up a territory. While America may expand by adding Texas to Mexico or Cuba to Canada, and while England may take over all of India, 2/3 of this planet belong to the Nantucketer. The sea is his empire. Just as emperors rule over land, other sailors merely pass through it. Merchant ships are like bridges between shores, and warships are nothing more than floating forts. Even pirates and privateers, who rob ships like highwaymen, only plunder other pieces of land-based life. They don't draw their livelihood from the depths of the sea itself like the Nantucketer does. He alone truly lives on the ocean. He alone, as the Bible says, goes down to the sea in ships, plowing the waves like his personal farmland. The sea is his home. His work continues, even if a flood like Noah's covers the land and drowns millions in China. He lives on the water as prairie chickens live on the plains. He hides among the waves and climbs them like hunters scaling the Alps. For years, he might never touch land, and when he finally does, the smell of it is so foreign, it's as if he's arrived on another planet, even stranger than the moon would be to someone from Earth. Like a seabird that folds its wings at sunset and is rocked to sleep on the ocean waves, the Nantucketer, far from any shore, furls his sails at night and lies down to sleep, while under him the sea teems with walruses and whales. Chapter 15. Chowder. It was pretty late in the evening when the little Moss finally anchored, and Queequeg and I went ashore. There wasn't time to take care of any real business that day, so we focused on finding dinner and a bed. The landlord at the Spouter Inn had recommended his cousin, Hosea Hussey, who owned the Trypots. He assured us that Cousin Hosea ran one of the best hotels in all of Nantucket and was famous for his chowder. Basically, he hinted that we couldn't do any better than trying our luck at the Trypots. However, the directions he gave us were quite confusing. Something about keeping a yellow warehouse on our right until we saw a white church on our left, then keeping the church on our left until we reached a corner 3 points to the right, and from there asking the first person we saw where to go. These tricky directions left us puzzled, especially when Queequeg insisted the yellow warehouse should be on the left, while I thought the landlord had said it was on the right. After a bit of wandering in the dark and knocking on a few doors for help, We finally found something unmistakable. There were two giant black wooden pots hanging by ropes from the crossbeams of an old mast, standing in front of a doorway. The crossbeams looked like the arms of a gallows, which gave me an eerie feeling. I couldn't help but stare at it, imagining the two remaining ropes were meant for Queequeg and me. A coffin as my innkeeper when I first landed in this whaling town, tombstones at the whaleman's chapel, and now this gallows with giant black pots. Was this some kind of omen? I was jolted from my thoughts by the sight of a freckled woman with yellow hair and a yellow dress, standing under a dim red lamp that looked like a bruised eye. She was busy scolding a man in a purple wool shirt. "Get going, or I'll give you a piece of my mind," she yelled at him. "Come on, Queequeg," I said. "That must be Mrs. Hussey." And I was right. Mr. Hosea Hussey was away, leaving Mrs. Hussey in charge. After telling her we wanted supper and a bed, she paused her scolding long enough to show us into a small room. She sat us at a table still covered in leftovers from the previous meal, then turned and asked, "Clam or cod?" "What's that, ma'am?" I asked politely, confused. "Clam or cod," she repeated. "A clam? A cold clam for supper in the middle of winter?" I said, trying to joke. "That sounds a bit too chilly, don't you think?" But Mrs. Hussey, eager to return to her scolding, didn't catch the humor. She heard the word clam and called into the kitchen. "Clam for two," before hurrying off. "Queequeg," I said, "do you think we can manage a whole supper with just one clam?" But soon the smell of something delicious wafted from the kitchen, promising more than just a clam. When the steaming chowder arrived, the mystery was solved. It was a rich, savory soup made with tiny, juicy clams no bigger than hazelnuts, mixed with crumbled ship biscuits and pieces of salted pork, all enriched with butter and seasoned perfectly with pepper and salt. With our appetites sharpened from the cold journey and Queequeg excited to see his favorite seafood, we ate it up in no time. Feeling curious after our meal, I decided to test something. I walked over to the kitchen and called out, "Cod!" Then I returned to my seat. A few moments later, another delicious smell filled the air, and soon enough, a cod chowder was placed before us. As we dug into the second chowder, I wondered if all this chowder was going to have any strange effects on us. I joked, "Queequeg, do you think eating all this chowder could make us chowder-headed?" And look, is that a live eel in your bowl? Where's your harpoon? The Trypots was the fishiest place you could imagine, and it earned its name well. There was always chowder boiling there. Chowder for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, until you started expecting to find fish bones in your clothes. The ground in front of the inn was paved with clam shells. Mrs. Hussey wore a necklace made of polished codfish bones, and Hosea Hussey had his account books bound in old shark skin. Even the milk tasted a bit fishy, which puzzled me until one day, I saw their cow munching on fish scraps along the beach, with each of her hooves stuck in a decapitated cod's head. She looked pretty slipshod, I assure you. After supper, we received a lamp and directions to our room from Mrs. Hussey. But as Queequeg started up the stairs, she stopped him and demanded he hand over his harpoon. Apparently, no harpoons were allowed in her rooms. "Why not?" I asked. "Every real whaleman sleeps with his harpoon. What's the harm?" "Because it's dangerous," she replied. "Ever since young Stiggs came back from a long voyage of 4.5 years with only 3 barrels of oil to show for it, and was found dead in my inn with his own harpoon in his side, I've not allowed anyone to bring dangerous weapons into my rooms. So, Mr. Queequeg," she had learned his name, "I'll just hold on to this until morning." Finally, she asked, "Clam or cod for breakfast tomorrow, gentlemen?" "Both," I replied, "and let's add a couple of smoked herrings for variety." Chapter 16. The Ship. That night in bed, we made plans for the next day. To my surprise and concern, Queequeg informed me that he had been consulting with his small black god, Yojo, who had told him multiple times, and very firmly, that I should be the one to pick the ship we would join, rather than both of us going together to choose one from the whaling fleet in the harbor. According to Yojo, he had already selected the perfect ship for us, and I would stumble upon it, seemingly by chance. He insisted that I should go alone and sign up for the voyage, without Queequeg. I forgot to mention earlier that Queequeg had a lot of faith in Yojo's judgment and ability to foresee things. He held Yojo in high regard, believing him to be a generally good god, though not always successful in carrying out his good intentions. I wasn't happy with this plan of letting Yojo dictate which ship we would board. I had been counting on Queequeg's sharp instincts to help us find the best vessel to carry us safely on our journey. But when I tried to argue, Queequeg wouldn't budge, so I had no choice but to go along with it. Determined to get the job done quickly, I prepared myself to tackle the task with energy and resolve. The next morning, I left Queequeg in our small room, where he was fasting for the day, observing some kind of religious ritual, maybe a Lent or Ramadan of sorts, with Yojo. He was sitting quietly with his tomahawk pipe, while Yojo warmed himself by a little sacrificial fire made of shavings. I set off to explore the docks. After wandering around and asking a few questions, I found out that 3 ships were preparing for 3-year voyages: the Devil Dam, the Titbit, and the Pequod. I didn't know the origin of the name Devil Dam, but Titbit was pretty self-explanatory, and Pequod was named after an extinct Native American tribe from Massachusetts. I took a good look at the Devil Dam, then hopped over to inspect the Titbit. Finally, I went aboard the Pequod, and after a quick survey, I decided that this was the ship for us. You may have seen some strange ships in your day: square-rigged luggers, massive Japanese junks, or clunky Dutch galliots, but I guarantee you've never seen anything like the Pequod. She was an old-fashioned ship, not too big, and had a weathered, claw-footed appearance. Her hull had been darkened by years of storms and calm seas in all 4 oceans, giving her a worn look like an old soldier who had fought in Egypt and Siberia. Her bow looked almost like it had a beard, and her masts, which had been replaced after being lost in a storm off Japan, stood tall like the spines of ancient kings. Her decks were so old and worn that they resembled the stone floors of Canterbury Cathedral where pilgrims worshipped. But beyond her age, the Pequod had some unique features that showed the brutal business she had been involved in for more than 50 years. Old Captain Peleg, who had been her first mate before becoming a captain of his own ship, had added his own personal touches to her design. She was decked out like a barbaric king, covered in trophies made from the bones of whales. Her sides were lined with long, sharp teeth from sperm whales, which served as pins to hold her ropes. The pulleys were made from sea ivory instead of regular wood, and her steering tiller was carved from the jawbone of a whale, making the helmsman feel like a rider holding back a wild horse. She was a noble ship, but also somehow melancholy, like all noble things. When I looked around the quarterdeck for someone in charge, there didn't seem to be anyone at first. But I did spot a strange tent or wigwam near the mainmast. It looked temporary and was made from large slabs of black whalebone. These slabs were arranged in a circle and sloped towards each other, meeting at the top like the tufted head of an old Native American chief. The front opening faced forward, giving a full view of the ship. Inside this odd structure, I found a man who looked like he was in charge. It was noon, and the ship's work was paused, so he was resting in an old, intricately carved wooden chair. He was an elderly man, brown-skinned and muscular like most old sailors, wrapped in blue pilot cloth cut in a Quaker style. His face was lined with countless wrinkles around his eyes, likely from years of squinting into the wind during storms. Those wrinkles gave him a naturally intense scowl. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about his appearance, but I had a feeling that he held some authority on the ship. "Is this the captain of the Pequod?" I asked as I approached the tent. "And if it is, what do you want with him?" the man replied. "I'm thinking of signing up for the voyage." "Thinking about it, huh? I can tell you're not from Nantucket. Ever been on a whaling ship before?" "No, sir, I haven't." "I thought so. You probably don't know much about whaling at all, do you?" "Not really, sir, but I'm confident I'll learn quickly. I've been on several merchant voyages, and I think—" "Merchant voyages? Don't speak to me about the merchant service. You see that leg? I'll take it right off again if you mention merchant ships to me. You think you're proud of your time in those ships, huh? But tell me, why do you want to go whaling? You're not running from something, are you? You haven't robbed your last captain, have you? Thinking of mutiny?" I quickly denied any such intentions. Beneath his rough words, I could sense that this old seaman, a true Nantucketer, was suspicious of anyone not from his island. Why do you want to go whaling? I need to know that before I consider taking you on. Well, sir, I want to see what whaling is all about, and I want to see the world. See what whaling is, eh? Have you met Captain Ahab? Who is Captain Ahab? I thought so. Ahab is the captain of this ship. Then I've made a mistake. I thought I was speaking to him. No, you're talking to Captain Peleg. It's my job, along with Captain Bildad, to get the Pequod ready for the voyage, make sure she's supplied, and gather the crew. We're part owners of the ship. But if you want to know what whaling is, as you say, there's a way to find out before you sign on for good. Take a look at Captain Ahab. He's only got one leg. What do you mean? Was the other lost to a whale? Lost to a whale? Come closer, lad. It wasn't just lost, it was bitten clean off by the biggest sperm whale that ever took down a boat. His intensity startled me a little, but I stayed calm and replied, I'm sure that's true, sir. But how could I know there was anything special about that particular whale? Though I suppose the fact that it took his leg speaks volumes. Young man, you've got soft lungs. You don't talk like someone who's been to sea. You sure you've sailed before? Yes, sir. I've been on 4 merchant voyages. Stop right there. Didn't I tell you not to mention the merchant service? But let's get something straight. I've given you a taste of what whaling's like. Are you still up for it? I am, sir. Good. Now, do you think you've got the guts to throw a harpoon down a live whale's throat and then jump in after it? Answer me quick. I would, sir, if it were absolutely necessary. Good. So, not only do you want to go whaling, but you want to see the world too, right? Well, step forward and take a look over the bow, then come back and tell me what you see. Puzzled by his request, I hesitated for a moment, but then did as he asked. Looking out, I saw the ship anchored and pointing towards the open ocean. The view was vast but bleak and uninviting. Well, what did you see? Peleg asked when I returned. Not much, just water and a distant horizon. Looks like a storm might be brewing. So, what do you think of seeing the world now? You still want to sail around Cape Horn to see more of it? Can't you see enough from where you stand? Though a bit shaken, I was determined to go whaling and told Peleg as much. The Pequod was a good ship, perhaps the best, and I wouldn't back out now. All right then, let's get you signed up. He led me below deck to the cabin. Inside sat a peculiar figure, Captain Bildad, another part owner of the ship. Bildad was a strict Quaker and had spent much of his life at sea, but he still clung to his Quaker ways. Despite the violence of whaling, he remained steadfast in his beliefs, although it didn't seem to trouble him much that his hands were stained with whale blood. Bildad had a reputation for being hard on his crew, though he never swore at them. His stern look alone was enough to make men work furiously under his watch. Peleg interrupted Bildad, who was reading a Bible. He wants to sign up, Bildad, Peleg said. Bildad looked up at me. Do you? He asked in a low voice. I do, I replied. What do you think of him, Bildad? Peleg asked. He'll do, Bildad said, returning to his book. Peleg then pulled out the ship's articles and began to fill them out. I knew I wouldn't be paid wages, but rather a share of the profits, called a lay. Given my inexperience with whaling, I figured I'd be offered a small lay, but I hoped it wouldn't be too small. Bildad, what lay should we give him? Peleg asked. Bildad replied without looking up. The 777th wouldn't be too much. I thought, what? That was an exceedingly small share. Peleg wasn't having it. No, he'll get the 300th lay, Peleg declared. Bildad objected, warning that being too generous might take food out of the mouths of widows and orphans who had shares in the ship. But Peleg insisted on the 300th lay, and that's what I got. As I prepared to leave, I asked if I could bring a friend to sign up too. Sure, bring him tomorrow, Peleg said. After signing the papers, I left, feeling like I'd done a good day's work. But I realized I still hadn't met Captain Ahab. Turning back, I asked Peleg where I could find him. What do you want with Ahab? You're already signed up, Peleg said. Yes, but I'd like to see him. I don't think you'll be able to just yet. He's not around much at the moment. Chapter 17. The Ramadan. Since Queequeg's Ramadan, his time of fasting and reflection, was going to last all day, I decided not to disturb him until evening. I respect everyone's religious practices, no matter how odd they may seem, and I couldn't bring myself to criticize even something as strange as a group of ants worshipping a mushroom, or people who bow down to a dead landowner's torso just because of the vast wealth still tied to his name. I believe that we Presbyterians should be charitable about these things and not think of ourselves as superior to others, whether they are pagans or whatever else, just because their beliefs might seem bizarre. Queequeg certainly had some strange ideas about his god Yojo and this Ramadan ritual, but that's his business. He seemed content with it, and arguing with him wouldn't have changed anything. Let him be, I say. May heaven have mercy on us all, Presbyterians and pagans alike, because in some way we're all a bit off our rocker and in need of fixing. Towards the evening, when I figured Queequeg's rituals were probably done, I went to his room and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried to open it, but it was locked from the inside. "Queequeg," I called softly through the keyhole. Silence. "It's me, Ishmael." Still no response. I started to get worried. I'd given him plenty of time, so I began to fear something had happened, like a stroke. I peeked through the keyhole, but the view was limited, and I could only see part of the bed and the wall. Strangely, I noticed his harpoon leaning against the wall, even though the landlady had taken it from him the night before. Since he never left without it, I figured he must still be inside. "Queequeg," I called again. Nothing. Now I was convinced something was wrong. I ran downstairs and told the first person I saw, the chambermaid, about my concerns. She cried out, "La! I thought something might be wrong. I tried to make the bed after breakfast, but the door was locked and it's been silent ever since. I just assumed you had gone out and locked your things in." She ran to alert the landlady, shouting about a possible stroke. Mrs. Hussey came quickly, holding a mustard pot in one hand and a vinegar bottle in the other, clearly interrupted while scolding a little boy. "What's wrong?" she asked. I told her we needed an axe to break down the door, thinking Queequeg had suffered some kind of medical emergency. But Mrs. Hussey, in a calm but firm manner, stopped me, unwilling to allow any damage to her property. She eventually fetched a key, but it didn't work because Queequeg had bolted the door from the inside. So I decided I had to force it open. Ignoring Mrs. Hussey's protests, I threw myself against the door, breaking it down with a loud crash. Inside, Queequeg was calmly sitting in the middle of the room, squatting with his wooden idol, Yojo, balanced on his head. He hadn't moved all day. Neither Mrs. Hussey nor I could get him to speak. He was so still and silent that I almost wanted to push him over just to see if he would react. I realized he must have been sitting like that for 8 to 10 hours without food, which seemed incredibly uncomfortable. I asked Mrs. Hussey to leave us alone, and I tried to convince Queequeg to sit in a chair, but he wouldn't budge or say a word. I figured this must be part of his Ramadan ritual, so I left him alone, assuming he would get up eventually. Later, I went down to dinner and listened to some sailors tell stories until almost 11 o'clock, thinking surely by now Queequeg had finished his fast. But when I returned to the room, he was still sitting in the same position. Frustrated and worried, I urged him to get up and eat, but he didn't respond. I gave up, went to bed, and even covered him with my heavy jacket since it was a cold night. Still, it was hard to sleep knowing Queequeg was sitting there wide awake in the cold, but eventually I dozed off. At dawn, I woke to find him still squatting in the same position. But as soon as the first sunlight came through the window, he got up, stiffly but cheerfully, and pressed his forehead against mine, announcing that his Ramadan was over. While I don't mind other people's religious practices, I draw the line when it becomes self-torture. So I tried to reason with Queequeg. I told him that all these rituals, Ramadan, fasting, squatting in uncomfortable positions for hours, were pointless and bad for his health. I explained that fasting weakens the body and, by extension, weakens the mind and soul. I even joked that the concept of hell probably came from someone with an upset stomach. Queequeg didn't seem too impressed by my arguments. He told me he'd only ever had indigestion once, after a big feast his father had held in celebration of a battle victory. I knew what that meant. His people had a custom of eating their defeated enemies. That was enough for me, and I changed the subject. Despite my lecture, I don't think I convinced him. He seemed to believe he knew more about religion than I did, and he looked at me with pity. as though I were the one who was misguided. In the end, we got up and dressed, and Queequeg ate a hearty breakfast before we headed out to board the Pequod, picking our teeth with fish bones as we walked along. Chapter 18. His Mark. As we walked toward the end of the pier, heading for the ship with Queequeg carrying his harpoon, Captain Peleg called out to us from his cabin in a gruff voice. He shouted that he hadn't realized my friend was a cannibal and stated that he didn't allow any cannibals on board unless they presented their papers. "What do you mean by that, Captain Peleg?" I asked, jumping onto the ship's railing, leaving Queequeg standing on the dock. "I mean," Peleg replied, "he has to show his papers." "Yes," added Captain Bildad in a hollow voice as he poked his head out from behind Peleg. "He needs to prove he's been converted." "Son of Darkness," he addressed Queequeg, "are you a member of any Christian church?" "He is," I quickly said. "He's a member of the First Congregational Church." It's worth noting that many tattooed savages sailing out of Nantucket eventually end up converting to Christianity. "The First Congregational Church?" Bildad shouted. "The one that worships at Deacon Deuteronomy Coleman's meeting house?" He pulled out his spectacles, wiped them with a large yellow handkerchief, put them on carefully, then leaned over the railing to take a long, hard look at Queequeg. "How long has he been a member?" he asked, turning to me. "Not for long, I bet, young man." "No," Peleg chimed in, "and I bet he hasn't been properly baptized either, or it would have washed off some of that blue devil ink on his face." "Well now," Bildad exclaimed, "is this Philistine really a member of Deacon Deuteronomy's meeting? I've never seen him there, and I walk by it every Sunday." "I don't know anything about Deacon Deuteronomy or his church," I said. "All I know is that Queequeg is a born member of the First Congregational Church. In fact, he's a deacon himself." "Young man," Bildad said sternly, "are you messing with me? What church are you talking about?" Realizing I had to explain myself, I said, "I mean the same ancient Catholic church that you, me, Captain Peleg, Queequeg, and everyone else in the world belong to. We're all part of that first congregation, even if some of us hold on to a few strange beliefs. But when it comes to the core faith, we're all united." "Splice hands, you mean?" Peleg interrupted, moving closer. "Young man, you should be a missionary, not a sailor. I've never heard a better sermon. Even Father Mapple couldn't beat it. Come aboard. Come aboard. Forget about the papers. Tell your friend here, what's his name, Quahog, to step on up. And by the great anchor, what a harpoon he's got there. Looks like good quality. Hey, Quahog, or whatever your name is, have you ever stood in the bow of a whaleboat? Ever struck a fish?" Without a word, Queequeg jumped onto the ship's railing, then into the bow of one of the hanging whaleboats. Bracing his knee, he aimed his harpoon at a tiny drop of tar on the water and said, "Captain, you see that small drop of tar? Let's pretend it's a whale's eye. Watch this." He took sharp aim and threw the harpoon right over Bildad's hat, across the deck, and hit the tar spot dead on. "Now," Queequeg calmly said as he pulled in the line, "if that was a whale's eye, that whale would be dead." "Quick, Bildad," Peleg said to his partner, who had backed away in shock from the flying harpoon. "Quick, get the ship's papers. We've got to get Quahog in one of our boats. Look, Quahog will give you the 90th share, more than any harpooner's ever gotten out of Nantucket." So we headed to the cabin, and to my great relief, Queequeg was soon officially signed on to the same ship's crew as me. Once the paperwork was ready, Peleg turned to me and asked, "I guess Quahog here can't write, can he? Can you sign your name, Quahog?" But Queequeg, who had been through this process a few times before, wasn't fazed. He took the pen and drew a perfect copy of a strange round symbol tattooed on his arm, which Peleg, still mistaking his name, accepted as a signature. It read Quahog, his X mark. Meanwhile, Captain Bildad was staring intently at Queequeg. Eventually, he pulled a tract from his coat pocket, titled "The Latter Day Coming," or "No Time to Lose," and handed it to Queequeg. Holding his hands in the book, Bildad looked into Queequeg's eyes and said, "Son of Darkness, I must do my duty. As part owner of this ship, I'm responsible for the souls of its crew. If you cling to your pagan ways, I beg you, don't remain in bondage to Belial. Turn from the idols and avoid the fiery pit." Bildad's language was a mix of seafaring jargon and religious phrases. "Stop, Bildad," Peleg interrupted. "Don't ruin our harpooner with your piety. Pious harpooners don't make good sailors. They lose their edge. Remember young Nat Swain? He was the best boat header around until he joined the church. After that, he got so worried about his soul that he was scared to face whales, afraid he'd be sent to Davy Jones' locker. Peleg, Bildad cried, raising his hands. You've faced death many times, just like I have. How can you joke about this? When the Pequod lost her masts in that typhoon off Japan, when you were first mate under Captain Ahab, did you not think of death and judgment then? Hear him now, Peleg shouted, pacing the cabin. Death and judgment? No, Captain Ahab and I were thinking about survival, how to save the crew, how to rig up new masts and make it to the nearest port. Death wasn't on our minds. Saving lives was. Bildad said no more, but buttoned his coat and went up on deck, where we followed. He quietly watched some sailmakers repairing a sail, occasionally bending down to pick up scraps of twine so they wouldn't be wasted. Chapter 19. The Prophet. Hey, shipmates, have you signed up for that ship? Queequeg and I had just left the Pequod and were strolling away from the water, each lost in our own thoughts, when a stranger approached us. He pointed his thick finger at the ship. He looked shabby in a worn jacket and patched pants, with a ragged black handkerchief around his neck. His face was marked with smallpox scars, resembling the dry bed of a stream after a flood. Have you signed up for her? He repeated. You mean the ship Pequod, right? I asked, trying to buy some time to get a better look at him. Yeah, that ship there, he said, extending his arm and pointing directly at it. Yes, I said. We just signed the papers. Anything in there about your souls? What? Oh, maybe you don't have any, he said quickly. That's fine. I know plenty of guys who don't, and they're better off for it. A soul is like an extra wheel on a wagon. What are you talking about? I replied. He's got enough to make up for the lack of souls in other guys, the stranger said, emphasizing the word he. Queequeg, I said. Let's go. This guy seems a little off his rocker. He's talking about things we don't understand. Wait, shouted the stranger. You're right. You haven't seen Old Thunder yet, have you? Who's Old Thunder? I asked, intrigued by his intensity. Captain Ahab. What? The captain of our ship, the Pequod? Yeah, among some of us old sailors. That's what we call him. You haven't seen him yet, have you? No, we haven't. They say he's sick, but he's getting better and should be fine soon. Fine soon, the stranger laughed in a darkly mocking way. Look, when Captain Ahab is fine, then this left arm of mine will be fine. Not before. What do you know about him? What did they tell you? Tell me. They didn't say much. I just heard he's a good whale hunter and a good captain. That's true enough, but you'd better jump when he gives an order. It's all about stepping and growling. That's how it is with Captain Ahab. But they didn't say anything about that incident off Cape Horn long ago, when he lay like a corpse for 3 days and nights. Nothing about that fight with the Spaniard in front of the altar in Santa. Didn't hear anything about that, did you? And nothing about the silver calabash he spat into? And nothing about him losing his leg on the last voyage, according to the prophecy. Didn't you hear a word about those things? No? I didn't think so. Who knows? Not even all of Nantucket, I guess. But surely you've heard about the leg and how he lost it, right? Everyone knows that. He has only one leg and a sperm whale took the other one. My friend, I said, I don't understand your rambling, and I don't really care. You seem a little out of your mind. But if you're talking about Captain Ahab of the Pequod, let me tell you, I know all about how he lost his leg. All about it, huh? You really know everything. Pretty much. The shabby stranger paused for a moment, lost in thought, then suddenly turned to us. So you've signed up, huh? Your names are on the papers? Well, what's signed is signed. What's meant to happen will happen, and maybe it won't after all. Anyway, it's all arranged. Some sailors have to go with him, I guess. Might as well be you as anyone else. God help you. Good morning, shipmates. Good morning. May the heavens bless you. Sorry to have stopped you. Listen, friend, I said. If you have something important to tell us, say it. But if you're just trying to mess with us, you've got the wrong idea. That's all I'll say. That's a good point, and I like to hear someone speak up like that. You're just the kind of person for him. The likes of you. Good morning, shipmates. Good morning. Oh, when you see him, tell him I've decided not to join. Ah, my good fellow, you can't fool us. It's easy for someone to look like they have a big secret. Good morning, shipmates. Good morning. Morning it is, I said. Come on, Queequeg, let's leave this crazy guy. But wait, what's your name? Elijah. Elijah, I thought, and we walked away, both commenting on this ragged old sailor and agreeing he was just a trickster trying to scare us. But we hadn't gone more than 100 yards when I looked back after turning a corner, and there was Elijah following us at a distance. The sight of him gave me pause, so I didn't mention it to Queequeg, but continued walking with him, curious to see if the stranger would turn the same corner. He did, and it felt like he was following us, but I couldn't figure out why. This strange behavior, along with his vague hints and half-revealing comments, filled me with all sorts of worries and curiosities about the Pequod, Captain Ahab, the lost leg, the incident at Cape Horn, the silver calabash, what Captain Peleg had said about him the day before, the Squaw Tistig's prophecy, our voyage, and 100 other shadowy thoughts. I was determined to find out if this ragged Elijah was truly following us. So I crossed the street with Queequeg and retraced our steps on that side, but Elijah moved on without acknowledging us. That relieved me, and once more, I quietly decided he was just a trickster. Chapter 20. All Astir. A day or two went by, and there was a lot of activity aboard the Pequod. Not only were the old sails being repaired, but new sails were being brought on board, along with rolls of canvas and coils of rigging. In short, everything indicated that the ship was nearing the end of its preparations. Captain Peleg hardly ever went ashore. He stayed in his hut, keeping a close eye on the crew. Bildad handled all the purchasing and supplies at the stores, while the men worked in the hold and on the rigging well into the night. The day after Queequeg signed the articles, word was sent out to all the inns where the crew was staying that their belongings needed to be on board before nightfall, as the ship could sail at any moment. So Queequeg and I packed up our things, planning to stay ashore as long as we could. But it turned out they always give plenty of notice in these situations, and the ship didn't set sail for several days. But that was understandable. There was a lot to do, and it was hard to say how many things needed to be thought of before the Pequod was fully equipped. Everyone knows how many things: beds, pots and pans, knives and forks, shovels and tongues, napkins, nutcrackers, and more are essential for running a household. It's the same with whaling, which requires 3 years' worth of supplies for life on the vast ocean, far from grocery stores, markets, doctors, bakers, and banks. While this is also true for merchant ships, it's not to the same degree as with whalers. Because whaling voyages are so long, they need many specific items for the fishing trade, and replacing them in the far-off ports they visit is usually impossible. Moreover, whaling vessels are the most susceptible to accidents of all kinds, especially losing the very things that determine the success of the voyage. Thus, they carry spare boats, extra masts, spare lines, harpoons, and practically everything else, except a spare captain and a duplicate ship. By the time we arrived on the island, most of the essential supplies for the Pequod had been loaded, including beef, bread, water, fuel, and iron hoops and staves. However, as I mentioned earlier, there was still a constant stream of various items, both large and small, being brought on board. Among those involved in this hustle was Captain Bildad's sister, a lean old woman with a determined spirit who was very kind-hearted. She seemed dedicated to ensuring that nothing was lacking on the Pequod once it set out to sea. Sometimes she would come aboard with a jar of pickles for the steward's pantry. Other times, she brought a bunch of quills for the chief mate's desk, where he kept his log, or a roll of flannel for someone's bad back. Never did a woman better deserve her name, which was Charity. Everyone called her Aunt Charity. Like a sister of charity, Aunt Charity busied herself with anything that would provide safety, comfort, and support to everyone aboard the ship, in which her beloved brother Bildad was involved, and in which she herself had a small investment. But it was surprising to see this kind-hearted Quaker woman come aboard the last day with a long oil ladle in one hand and an even longer whaling lance in the other. Bildad and Captain Peleg were just as active. Bildad carried a long list of needed items, and with each new arrival, he marked off what had come on the paper. Every now and then, Peleg would hobble out of his whalebone den, shouting at the men down the hatches, yelling up to the riggers at the masthead, and then would return to his hut. During these busy days of preparation, Queequeg and I often visited the ship, and I frequently asked about Captain Ahab, how he was doing, and when he would come aboard. They would respond that he was getting better and was expected any day. Meanwhile, the two captains, Peleg and Bildad, managed everything necessary to prepare the vessel for its journey. If I had been truly honest with myself, I would have recognized that I was only half excited about committing to such a long voyage without ever meeting the man who would be in complete control as soon as the ship sailed out into the open sea. But when someone suspects something is wrong, they sometimes try to hide those feelings from themselves, even if they are already involved in the situation. That's how it was with me. I said nothing and tried not to think about it. Finally, it was announced that the ship would definitely sail the next day. So the following morning, Queequeg and I got an early start.